So who here remembers the Xbox Kinect? Yeah, I recently made a video talking about the long string of missteps and mistakes that Microsoft has made throughout the history of Xbox. And a very large one that I wasn't able to get into at the time was just about everything related to the Kinect and the Kinect 2 that was packed in with the Xbox One. I truly believe that these devices are emblematic of just how badly Microsoft understands the needs of developers and their consumers when it comes to the gaming space. The thing is so much worse than just a simple cash grab to try and ride the coattails of the Wii's success. I truly believe that this device is so bad that it's not just that it didn't work for the time, it's that the Kinect is a fundamentally flawed device that really couldn't have worked the way that Microsoft hoped it would. So to start explaining what I mean by that, I feel like when people look back at the Kinect, the first complaint that most people will bring up is that it just didn't work very well at the time. Since it required you to stand up and move around, that meant that you needed a big wide open area in your living room to actually be able to use the thing. Like at least with the Wii, I can play most motion control games while comfortably seated still. Meanwhile, with the Kinect, I feel like you can't go more than 10 minutes without getting some kind of alert that you're too close or you're too far away or that it just generally lost track of you. And on top of that, lots of people would report things like that certain colored clothes you were wearing could mess up the body tracking, and some kinds of glasses would ruin the facial recognition, and just all kinds of issues like that with actually getting the hardware to do its job correctly. However, these are not the kinds of issues that I want to focus on for this video. Believe me, it is quite easy to just pull up a video of some streamer trying to get the thing to work and failing, and we could just all point and laugh at the thing not working and call it a day right there. But that is not the point I'm trying to make. If the device's issues merely came down to the fact that the hardware and software was inadequate for its time, then it would sound like all you would need to do to fix the Kinect was to keep iterating on it until it's good. You might even be able to say that it was an idea that was merely ahead of its time. But I think the Kinect's issues run far, far deeper than that. So for the sake of this discussion, let's pretend that the Kinect is actually a perfect piece of hardware that works pretty much perfectly and exactly as advertised. After all, I don't want a million comments just saying, well, it worked fine for me, and so on. So we're going to just try to imagine the Kinect at its best, and I'm going to try and only critique it in ways beyond just commenting on how well it functioned. So first of all, there are the issues that I think are inherent to pretty much all motion control systems that have been used in gaming up to this point, including everything from the Wii to even some modern virtual reality systems, that the Kinect just somehow manages to make even worse. The biggest one, of course, being the lack of any kind of physical feedback. They show off a lot of games in their concept trailers that include things like performing martial arts and other kinds of melee combat, but that would 100% feel awful to do on the Kinect, or really any other kind of motion control system, due to the lack of any way for the game to provide physical feedback to the player. All of your attacks inherently have no weight behind them because you're not physically actually carrying anything in your hands. So if you stab an enemy with a sword or punch a guy in the face, your hand would just keep moving due to its momentum instead of being stopped by the impact like it should. It's why I think motion control games in general tended to move away from direct melee combat and other physical actions. If you have some kind of weapon that is actually meant to cut through everything like butter, like a lightsaber, then I guess it can kind of work a little bit better, but that is still very limiting in terms of design space. And even when you're not talking about overt melee combat, things like guns can't provide recoil or any sense of weight to reflect how powerful they are either. Even something as simple as merely picking an object up and moving it around in general would just kind of feel awkward to do. Now, obviously, there are plenty of games that do exist that use things like swords and guns with motion controls on a variety of platforms, but at the very least, when we're talking about the Wii or the PlayStation Move, or especially modern VR systems, you still have a controller in your hand, and they can do things like give you vibrations to provide at least some kind of physical feedback to help heighten the experience. When I hit a ball in Wii Tennis, or I slice through a block in Beat Saber, for example, there's a tiny vibration to help sell that impact at least a little more than it would otherwise, and make the experience feel at least a little bit less like I'm just swinging my arms in the air. But with the Kinect, you don't even get that luxury since you don't have any kind of controller in your hands, so you can't possibly get even the slightest hint of any kind of physical feedback for your actions. And at least potentially in the future with VR gloves, we might be able to get something that can provide some deeper level of physical sensations, but that kind of concept is well outside of the limitations of the Kinect. So the fact that you are the controller when it comes to the Kinect only serves to really take an existing problem with motion controls and make it even worse. Speaking of VR, I feel like VR kind of highlights another problem with the Kinect, which is the lack of a real first-person perspective that you can use to look around your environment with. The Kinect is meant to try and emulate your body movements perfectly in the game. After all, you don't have a controller in your hands, so that's kind of all that's left for them to focus on. However, I think that this can lead to a kind of disconnect due to the fact that you're not actually looking at things from a first-person perspective. What I mean is that say you're just picking up an object like a sword or whatever in-game. With Kinect, you're often controlling an avatar and they're the ones picking up the sword as they mirror your movements, which I feel kind of misses the point of trying to track my body movements one-to-one. It feels less like I'm immersed in the game and more like I'm having to awkwardly puppet this avatar around with my limbs for some reason. And even if the game is shown from a first-person perspective without using a third-person avatar, it's not like you can look down and see the sword in your hand because the sword is going to be 5 feet in front of you on the TV because that's the only way that they can actually display things to you. So even a quote-unquote first-person game still feels weirdly third-person because they can't actually display things to line up with where your body actually is in physical space. And on top of that, it's not like you can really look around either. Like, if you're playing a golfing game, for example, you can't really look down at your ball because the TV is still going to be in front of you. You can't even turn to the side because, again, your TV and the Kinect itself are all in one position and all the tracking is coming from there. So if you turn sideways and move your arm behind your torso, even with our hypothetically perfect Kinect that always works, there's literally just no physical way for it to track a body part that it cannot see. So if you think about it, if they want to incorporate any mechanics that involve your legs, like playing goalie for a soccer team, they kind of have to resort to this third-person perspective and show an avatar that you're controlling, because how else are they supposed to display anything related to your legs accurately when your TV screen is presumably not laying on the ground by your feet and you don't have the ability to otherwise look down? So ironically enough, systems that effectively only track your upper body like the Wii actually kind of makes more sense in the context of a living room for these reasons. Meanwhile, with systems like virtual reality headsets, the tracking is designed to work no matter which way you're facing, and the screen is basically glued to your face so that you can actually look in any direction you want. I know most VR systems these days don't actually bother with full body tracking just yet, but the few that do still work a million times better than the Kinect, since you can actually physically look down to see where things are without needing to puppet an avatar in third person. Now, sure, comparing the Kinect to modern VR systems might be a little unfair, seeing as the Kinect originally came out in 2010, and I'm talking about hardware from the 2020s. But my point is that even if they kept iterating on the Kinect, even if they kept making new ones for every new Xbox console to this day, like some people apparently wanted them to, this problem would still exist due to the fundamental limitations of the hardware. Making a bigger, better Kinect wouldn't suddenly allow you to look at your floor and still see your TV screen, and even if they did make hardware that lets you do that, then we'd be talking about a completely different concept that is absolutely nothing like what the Kinect itself was actually designed to be. But okay, I can already hear some of the comments coming in. Blaze, you're just describing the problems with motion controls as a whole. Most of these issues still apply to other systems like the PlayStation Move and the Wii to at least some degree. And to that I say, well, yeah, I think that there are plenty of reasons why motion controls as a whole pretty much left the limelight completely after the 7th generation of consoles. Although, as I've described, I do think that the Kinect takes these existing problems and only makes them even worse than they were already due to their design decisions. However, I think this last point really sets apart the Kinect and makes its problems really stand out on its own, and that is the issue of abstraction, or rather the lack thereof. You see, and you may not realize this about me, I am not an expert martial artist. I am not some kind of badass space bounty hunter. I am not even a pro tennis player. So when we play a video game, the reason why we're able to emulate these things as if we were professionals in these respective fields is through the art of abstraction. This may be difficult to understand for some of you, but it's a lot easier to generate a fireball made of key energy by pressing a few buttons on a controller than it is to do so in real life. So the point that I'm trying to get at here is that I really cannot overstate how important the concept of buttons are to making video games playable. They really help close the gap between the player and the avatar's capabilities. And this is what really sets the Kinect apart from its other motion controller contemporaries. To try and show what I mean, let's just imagine that we want to try and create a simple first-person shooter for the Wii versus the Kinect. Well, what mechanics do we need? Of course, we need to be able to aim and shoot. That's kind of the fundamental part of a first-person shooter. We'll need to be able to move around, of course, so we can actually go to our various enemies that we want to shoot. If we have more than one weapon type for any amount of gameplay variety, we'll need to be able to switch weapons. And reloading is important, of course, in most first-person shooters, so we probably want that as well. There's a number of other mechanics that we'll likely want for any kind of unique gameplay, but I think that's a nice starting point, right? So, if we were making this game for the Wii, it'd be a fairly simple order. The aiming can be done with the motion controls, of course, and we can fire by simply pressing a trigger button. We've got an analog stick on the nunchuck to help us move around and reposition our view, and we have a variety of other buttons at our disposal for things like reloading and swapping weapons, and any other mechanics that we feel like implementing. But what if we were developing for the Kinect? Well, just like with the Wii, we can aim by pointing our arm at the screen. It's a little bit more awkward since you're not actually holding anything, but I guess that works. But when it comes to actually firing our gun, I mean, I guess with our hypothetical perfect Kinect, it might be good enough to consistently track our individual finger movements to register a trigger pull. Or maybe we could do something with our wrist or our other hand to signal that we're firing. I mean, already we're starting to run into issues. We haven't even gotten to the other mechanics yet. I guess if we change our game concept to be about maybe firing a bow, that might work better with how the Kinect tracks our limbs, but now we've already heavily limited the kinds of games that we can make. And when it comes to the other fundamental mechanics, like how do we even handle something as basic as simple movement controls with the Kinect? It's not like you can physically walk around your environment, and our arms are already tied up with all of the gunplay, so I guess we're kind of stuck with jogging in place to walk, but how do we even do things like, say, strafe to the side or move backwards? Can you even strafe in place? And if so, how can you meaningfully differentiate that from walking forwards in place? And hell, how do you even jump with any kind of precision? So I guess jumping's off the table. And so, I think that this thought experiment is rapidly explaining why so many Kinect experiences either rooted the player in one spot, or were otherwise a very on-rails kind of game, with the player having very little control over movement. It's much more of a limitation of the hardware than any kind of a design choice. And we're not even done yet. We still need to figure out how to implement basic fundamental mechanics like swapping weapons or ammo types, or reloading, or any actually unique mechanics that we want to introduce to our game. We might need to start dipping into things like using voice commands to swap weapons like Judge Dredd or something, and that's just a whole other can of worms that I don't want to open. So yeah, like, I think it's becoming very obvious with just this really quick experiment why the Kinect is extremely limiting to design for, when your only form of input is motion gestures with no buttons for any kind of abstraction. You very quickly run out of distinct ways to actually let the player perform actions in your game, and you end up having to cut back on what would otherwise be considered very basic features in order to accommodate the hardware. And sure, maybe you're thinking that I just picked a bad genre for the Kinect, that the Kinect just isn't suited to first-person shooters. And maybe that is true, but I mean, they worked fine on the Wii. Metroid Prime played excellently, and that was a fully fledged explorable world that you could explore, and with different weapons and fast-paced combat and all that jazz. So even if that's true, that just means that Microsoft made a device that is less capable than hardware that came out 3 years prior that is also cheaper to buy. But I don't think the genre I picked is the issue here. I mean, the biggest problem I ran into right away was just trying to come up with a way for the Kinect to emulate some method of simply moving in 3D space. Maybe you could have some kind of setup to combine the use of the 360 controller with the Kinect, but then you're either all bunched up on a sofa while holding the controller, which doesn't really utilize the Kinect very well, or you're awkwardly standing around while holding a 360 controller, and then you have to like take your hands off of it to wave it around for a quick gesture or something. Either way, it doesn't really feel like a good solution to me, unless you just design a new controller from the ground up, specifically to be utilized with the Kinect, at which point we've just recreated the Wii again. Say what you will about how derivative the PlayStation Move seemed by comparison, but you may as well not try to fix what ain't broke. Not to mention that not having any buttons makes menu navigation in these games just an absolute drag, as you wave your arms around like an idiot trying to get the game to just move over to the next option, and of course it can't go too quickly or else it might misread your inputs and skip what you want, so everything in these menus has to go by so slowly. It turns out nobody actually likes navigating menus like that scene from Minority Report. And like I said at the start, all of these complaints are ignoring the fact that the thing just doesn't really read your inputs very well to begin with. So, to leave our fantasy land for just a minute, keep in mind that we have all of these issues that I've talked about already, combined with the fact that the hardware, in my experience at least, is just less precise than almost every other platform, including the Wii from 3 years earlier. So yeah, if you want to design a proper game for the Kinect, that means that you need to design a game where you primarily stay in one spot, facing one direction, you can't have any kind of physical interactions, and the task the player is performing needs to be something that people can do one-to-one in real life, since there's no way to really abstract their actions. And yeah, you've probably figured out by now that the game I'm talking about is Just Dance, which I think is a good lead-in to start talking about the games that were actually made for the device, and I think that with these limitations I've pointed out, it becomes pretty clear why so many of these games either flopped or were extremely limited in scope. Now, to its credit, I do think that Just Dance is kind of the perfect Kinect game. Like, this is actually unironically a good video game without having to really put on any qualifiers that actually uses the Kinect as it should be used. Like I said, dancing is something that you can do in one small area, mostly facing the same direction, so there's no need to worry about the lack of movement controls. You're not controlling an avatar or some kind of weird third-person thing, so there's no risk of dissonance between the player and the game, and dancing is something that most people can at least learn how to do in real life. It honestly fits so well that I would almost call the Kinect basically a Just Dance peripheral, similar to how the guitar controller was obviously made for Guitar Hero. But there are other games that were made with the bounds of the Kinect, of course, and it has a surprising number of games for it, but most of them suffer a lot more from these limitations that we've talked about already. For example, the Steel Battalion game tries to give the player more options by simulating them being in the cockpit of a mech. But at the end of the day, this is literally a game where they take away your controller so that you can use the Kinect to emulate hitting buttons in a cockpit. Like, at that point, you might as well just give me the controller back so that my inputs are at least a lot more quick and precise, and I don't have to tire out my arms so much. It's at least better than pretending to hit buttons in a fake cockpit. Another game that I saw that tries to work within these limitations was one called Fable the Journey, which is some kind of Fable spin-off. It's a game I didn't know actually existed until I did research for this video, and it kind of tries to solve movement by having you holding onto the reins of a horse, and the main gameplay is based around casting spells and performing gestures, which I don't think is a terrible idea on the surface, but one glance at the comments section for any of the trailers for this game reveals what people actually thought about it. At the end of the day, the horse riding was functionally just on rails, and the spellcasting had a very limited variety of options, and was basically just a very slow and awkward shooting gallery where you barely even had to aim, since actually aiming while doing gestures on the Kinect is kind of an awkward concept. But yeah, other than that, the only actually decent games that I can find that people seem to generally agree on is, of course, Just Dance. You've got Kinect Sports, which seems like a pretty competent Wii Sports knockoff, although it seems like it probably will only hold your attention for about as long as Wii Sports would have, if that. And the only other decent game I could really find without having to add too many qualifiers was a Fruit Ninja port, which, I mean, Fruit Ninja is fun, I guess, but is it really an experience worth buying an extra peripheral for, just so that I can play it while waving my arms around in my living room? And there's a few more that I didn't get to, like there's some general fitness games akin to Wii Fit, but yeah, I think you get the idea by now. This isn't really a system that is capable of big, flashy AAA experiences. The Kinect just has too many problems holding back the developers from making anything more complex than the just most basic scenarios possible. It doesn't solve any of the existing problems that motion control games had at the time, while only making the existing issues worse and introducing completely new ones on top of that. And so, I want to finish this video out by going into a little bit more detail about why I think that the Kinect 2 was emblematic of how poorly Microsoft understands gaming, and why it was one of their biggest mistakes. The first Kinect, I'm willing to give them a freebie on. Everyone wanted to chase the success of the Wii, so they tried to copy Nintendo's homework and change some words around, and they accidentally deleted the thesis of the paper and made it objectively worse. But for those of you who don't know, or those of you who didn't watch my last video talking about the history of misplays by Microsoft, they did actually make a Kinect 2 to be released alongside the Xbox One. Or well, actually, it was required to be purchased along with an Xbox One. Now, to be fair, I do understand Microsoft's logic here. A big reason why gaming peripherals like these tend to not get a ton of games made for them is because they inherently have a much smaller install base. You need to be someone who already has a 360 and is willing to buy a Kinect on top of that in order to play a Kinect game. So if I'm Mr. John Game Developer and I'm making a new game, I could either choose to make the game for the 360, or I could make the game for the Kinect, which only has a quarter as many people that own the thing, even before we take into account all the difficulties that come with designing for the Kinect. I'm already limiting my potential customer base to only like a quarter of what it would be normally, especially since if I make a game for the 360, at least I could then port it to more platforms beyond that. So if I'm Mr. John game developer and I'm making a new game, I could either choose to make a game for the 360, or I could make a game for the Kinect, which only has a quarter as many people that own the thing. So even before we take into account all the difficulties that come with designing for the Kinect, I'm already limiting my potential customer base to less than a quarter of what it would be normally, especially since if I make a game for the 360, at least I could then port it to even more platforms beyond that a lot more easily. So by making the Kinect 2 an inherent part of the Xbox One, they do kind of inherently solve that problem. Now every person who owns an Xbox One will also own a Kinect, so developers will inherently have a wider install base and thus more incentive to make games for it. I mean, that's what Nintendo did with the Wii, and it worked out really well for them, right? Except the problem is that they didn't actually solve any of the issues with the hardware itself. Yes, it is a more advanced piece of tech, and it tracks you more consistently and works in more lighting conditions and whatnot, but it doesn't solve any of the issues with the lack of physical feedback, the limitations of the player's perspective, and most importantly, the lack of any way for the player to abstract their actions due to the lack of a controller. So actually making games for the Kinect 2 is just as difficult from a design perspective as it was before, and that's the real underlying problem with the device that was completely neglected. So sure, the install base will theoretically be a lot higher, but that also comes with its own downsides, because hardware costs money, and after all, this boneheaded decision to double down on the Kinect meant that their console cost $100 more than their most direct competition. Now, to be fair, as I said in my last video, link in the description by the way, there's lots of other reasons why the Xbox One failed, but making so many bad decisions in a row only to cap it off by increasing their price well above their competition so that they could include a piece of hardware that 75% of their user base clearly didn't care about was basically the final nail in the coffin for the Xbox One. That's why I didn't want to focus on the functionality of the hardware itself with my criticisms, because even if they kept iterating on the Kinect and keep making new ones for every new console till the end of time, until the hardware gets perfect and there's no loss of tracking or anything, they would still have all of these fundamental design limitations that would heavily restrict the kinds of games that people could make for the platform. So almost no developer would want to actually make anything for the Kinect, regardless of how many times they iterate on it, unless they fundamentally change how the device works and just go in a completely different direction, more akin to the Wii or a modern VR headset. And that's also why I said at the start that the Kinect is in many ways emblematic of how Microsoft tends to not understand the needs of developers and players. They focused purely on the numbers problem in their spreadsheets and didn't bother to meaningfully change the hardware at all to solve the design problems that developers were actually struggling with. But I think that'll do it for today. At the end of the day, I think the Kinect is just worse and more limiting than pretty much every other motion control system out there, including several that came out before it was even made. And motion controls already had plenty of problems on their own. Nowadays, with complex VR systems on the rise, it's almost embarrassing to even compare the two. But as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. Did any of you have a Kinect, and what did you think of it at the time? I won't deny that there are definitely a handful of experiences that can make the technology feel neat to play with, but I think there's just not much left to find under the surface after those initial experiences. So I'm curious if you guys have anything more to say of note, or if you found anything else of note to use it for. And if you liked what you saw, remember to leave me a like. If you want to see me make more videos like this, then make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so that you can get notified of when I make more videos like this in the future. And if you really want to help me out, then you can become a member on YouTube or donate to my Ko-Fi to help me keep doing what I'm doing. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.